One of the authorities with whom we spoke regarding the origins of human beings in Africa was Dr. Charles S. Finch of Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia.
One thing that is indubitably clear is that Africa is the cradle of the entire human race. From 4 million years ago all the way up to 200,000 years ago, the stepwise sequence leading in an evolutionary progression from early pre-human hominid ancestors all the way up to modern human beings occurred in Africa and Africa alone. Not that there weren't any migrations out of Africa, but those migrations did not have any impact on human evolutions leading up to modern human beings until after our human beings in fact left Africa. Now, what do I mean by that? A man by the name of Wainscott from England has said is that all of the populations around the globe are descendants from small founder populations that left Africa probably no later than 100,000 years ago. This means that, as C.W. Stringer has said, that all 6.5 billion people on this planet are Africans under the skin. Because if we go back far enough, everyone has an African ancestor. That you did not see the development of specific human races until about 50,000 years ago, when these founder populations left Africa, began to inhabit certain parts of the globe, Europe, Asia, and then, because of rather sudden and drastic climatic changes, underwent some adaptations that led to the development of variations in the human species, which we today call races, or subgroups of the human species. But as I say, if you look at the root and the trunk, you are talking about a root and a trunk that is in African soil, literally. So that in effect, all 6.5 billion people who live on the planet today are descended from a founding population or an original population that emerges in Africa certainly 200,000 years ago, very likely, no later than 140,000 years ago, and does not leave Africa until maybe 100,000 years ago.
Whether we call her Lucy or Eve, the African woman left her mark over a broad spectrum of the prehistoric and ancient worlds. Small carvings of short, heavy-set women with thick, woolly hair, often called fertility idols, have been found in Europe, from Italy to Russia. Scientists have labeled the people of that time Grimaldis, after the caves in France where their skeletons were first discovered. Some authorities believe that these ancient blacks migrated into Europe from Africa more than 30,000 years ago and were part of a loose cultural network that extended from South Africa into Central Europe. Sculptures, cave drawings, weapons and tools of the Grimaldis suggest that they were a highly advanced people who held black women in general and motherhood in particular in very high esteem.
Playing throughout France, my colleague James Brunson is located one in the former Soviet Union that's about 14,000 years old, and you do have a lot of them in other parts of Asia. I would think they would tend to represent the widespread movement of ancient black people in a prehistoric period, and by prehistoric I mean before written records, before written history, and they may be religious figurines. The earliest carvings of human-like people that you find anywhere in the world are almost exclusively of women, particularly of women who are obese, with large breasts and very heavily developed buttocks and thighs. Why? Because this is an image of female fecundity or fertility and abundance and productivity, and of course with the largeness of breasts, the image of female capacity for nurturance. You see this in Europe. You certainly see that in the Nile Valley and elsewhere. And we find, by the way, in the Nile Valley, that the oldest deity, the oldest form of the deity, takes shape as Ta-Urt. Ta-Urt is the hippopotamus goddess who was one of the earliest images of the deity and who was feminine and maternal because she was obese and therefore was an image of the pregnant female.
As we have noted, prehistoric Africans did not end their migrations in Europe. They were adventurous pioneers whose descendants climbed rugged mountains, crossed torrid deserts, explored treacherous jungles, and ultimately sailed over large parts of the globe. Sacred texts, sculptures, skulls, drawings, and paintings reveal the worldwide presence of these black people. In all of the artwork, the black female is very prominent. Her figurines have been discovered in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, Western Asia, India, and in vast parts of the prehistoric New World. We have seen the black woman as mother of the entire human family. We've also charted the course of her descendants around the world. Although she has left to us a global legacy, the black woman's most important and continuous contributions have been made on the continent of Africa. As you can see, it is a huge continent, second only to Asia in size. Let us return then to Africa to see what exciting revelations await us there. In a brilliant article written in the Journal of African Civilization's 1987 edition, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries provides an overview of the image of black women in African cave art. Just as many scholars before her, she found that perhaps the most ancient artwork, dating back 10,000 years, was discovered in the central Sahara region. But other rock paintings were also found in North, East, West, Central, and South Africa. What does this art tell us about ancient African women? According to Jeffries, it presents them in a variety of ways. Some paintings show black women in a symbolic manner as primordial mother or Mother Nature who creates and nurtures all life. Certain sculptured pieces appear to represent fertility and motherhood, which were highly regarded by African people. A number of paintings show women gathered together wearing curious masks and vulture headdresses. In still other scenes, we find women talking together, posing, dancing, carrying pottery vessels, and relaxing with their children. One of the most popular of the prehistoric paintings is a depiction of two young ladies referred to as Pule women. Their attire is surprisingly similar to modern dress. In this set of tapes, we shall reveal little-known or acknowledged facts of history about black people in ancient times. On the cover of its issue of January 1988, Newsweek magazine carried a painting of a young black couple flanking the biblical tree of life. The picture was captioned, "The Search for Adam and Eve." Newsweek has revealed what many scientists and scholars now believe, that Africa was the birthplace of the human family, that the first members of what we now describe as the modern human race were black Africans, and that all human beings around the world share common roots in prehistoric Africa. In other words, we all stem from the same African family tree. For thousands of years, the only people on Earth were Africans. They migrated throughout the great continent and made many discoveries along the way. They learned to domesticate animals, to cultivate crops, and to build shelters for protection against the elements. They also organized themselves into families, clans, and tribes. During what is called the Pleistocene Age, which ended about 10,000 years ago, the region which is now referred to as the Sahara had a climate much cooler and wetter than it is today. This part of Africa was covered with grasslands and forests, as well as a number of lakes and streams. Elephants, giraffes, and other animals roamed the land, which was also populated by a highly advanced black people whose prehistoric rock paintings still visible today. The southernmost portions of the Nile, which are closest to its origins, are called the Upper Nile, while the northern reaches of the river near the Mediterranean Sea are called the Lower Nile. The entire length of the Nile River extends through the continent of Africa. In other words, no portion of this great river crosses Europe, Asia, or any other land mass. All of the great civilizations that sprang from the Nile were also located on the continent of Africa. The saga you are about to witness will take you back to the ancient Nile, to Nubia and Egypt, the first great nations on Earth. It is a summary of that faraway, now almost forgotten, golden age in the history of black people. It was a time when black pharaohs and queens did indeed rule the civilized world of their day, and the achievements of these ancient people have had an important impact on modern society. An ancient and proud people who would build a great civilization, who would create an empire that would extend into the interior of Africa, engulf Asia Minor, embrace the Middle East, and influence the entire Mediterranean world. These ancient people would build monuments of great magnitude and splendor, monuments that would be the envy of the ancient world, monuments that would serve as the blueprint and foundation for modern civilization. They also invented law and mathematics, science, writing, music, and agriculture. Who were these people? Where did they come from? Strong evidence indicates that they came from the south, from a country through which the Nile flows, from the land of Nubia, or what we call the northern Sudan in Africa. The Nubians of antiquity stated that Egypt was a colony of their land, and that the Egyptians derived their laws and customs from their Nubian cousins to the south. A number of scholars hold this opinion today.
The pharaonic civilization that later came to characterize ancient Egypt had already existed in what we call Nubia for at least 300 years before the first dynasty. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Egypt and Nubia were part of the same cultural complex. There was no essential cultural, linguistic, ethnic, or racial difference between them. The differences, such as they were in the manner of regional differences, much as the difference you might find in England between, say, an Englishman and a Welshman, in the Central Europe between a German and an Austrian, in Italy between an Italian, for example, and a Sicilian. So even though these are regional variations, if you will, they still belong to the same general civilization complex. So did Egypt and Nubia, and the Egyptians themselves said so. They themselves knew that their civilization derived from the southern part of their, south of their borders, and they knew that it derived from what we call Nubia, or Ethiopia. So civilization itself descends the Nile from Inner Africa. If you will, it crystallizes in Nubia, and then reaches its highest and final form in the land called Kemet, or ancient Egypt, over a period of 4,000 years.
Some scientists insist that pyramid building also began in Nubia and was refined and perfected after the Nubians moved northward and settled in Egypt. Even mummification appears to have started in Nubia and to have spread northward into Egypt 500 years after it was invented. Nubia was also considered the land of the gods and the spiritual home of the Egyptian people. Perhaps that is why the chief beneficent gods and goddesses of Egypt, such as Osiris and Isis, were depicted as black. Egypt's cultural, physical, and spiritual legacy was chiefly derived from the black Nubian South. This no doubt explains why, in later years, the visiting Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, and others described the ancient Egyptians as black-skinned with close curled hair. The distinguished writer, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, captured the opinions of the ancients when he wrote, "We conclude, therefore, that the Egyptians were Negroid, and not only that, but by tradition they believed themselves descended, not from the whites or the yellows, but from the black people of the South. Thence they traced their origin, and toward the South in earlier days, they turned the faces of their buried corpses." Du Bois might also have added that the Egyptians themselves called their country Kemet, which many scholars interpret as land of the blacks. Now that we've learned about the origin of these ancient people, let us see how Egypt became a great African nation. Because of the surrounding desert, Egypt was shielded from invasion for thousands of years. During that time, various people who occupied the Nile Valley began working together. The Nile overflowed its banks every year. Controlling the river was important if the people wanted to grow food successfully. The Egyptians first formed villages that cooperated with each other. Cooperation led to organization, and organization led to the building of a great nation. A little over 5,000 years ago, another important step took place. At that time, the nation was divided into two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. A black man, Narmer, united the two lands into one. This followed a war in which Narmer's troops defeated Asian immigrants who had settled in Lower Egypt. Narmer became the first pharaoh or king of Egypt, following the great kings of Ta-Seti in Nubia. This pharaoh began the rule of what is called the dynasty, which is a line of kings and queens of the same family. Narmer had a glorious reign of 62 years. One of his greatest achievements was diverting the Nile River and creating the delta where he built the city of Memphis. This was the beginning of Egypt's golden age. During the reigns of these pharaohs, Egyptian society evolved into classes. First, there were the peasants or laborers. Then came the builders, artists, jewelers, and other skilled workers. After them were the warriors, priests and officials. Finally, there was the pharaoh or king. The women of Egypt were also an integral part of the society. Many of them engaged in the same labor that men did, and they had equal opportunity to own, manage, and receive property. There were also many prominent women in ancient Egypt, some of whom reigned during the Golden Age.
Women in particular. You have a woman whose name is Hetepheres. She is the great royal wife of Sneferu, who commissioned 3 massive pyramids, and the mother of Khufu. But in the 6th dynasty, at the end of the 6th dynasty, you have a woman known as Nitocris, and she's spoken of specifically by Herodotus as being a pharaoh, and also the person who commissioned the 3rd of the Great Pyramid projects at Giza. And she's called the loveliest and fairest woman of her time.
The most renowned Egyptian women ruled during the Middle and New Kingdoms. A few were even as powerful as the great pharaohs themselves. Other women were content to exercise their influence behind the throne. Many of its achievements were staggering. For example, Imhotep, the brilliant philosopher, architect, and scientist, also became the true father of medicine. Through his influence, the Egyptians developed antiseptics, vaccinations, and advanced surgical techniques, and they found cures for numerous diseases. In short, the Egyptians laid the foundation for modern medical science.
Scientific medicine begins in ancient Egypt. That is to say, if we look at the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, I call it the founding document of scientific medicine anywhere in the world. From the point of view of the sciences that we call the related disciplines of medical science, that is anatomy, physiology, pathology, pharmacology, those were organized as coherent scientific disciplines first in ancient Egypt. The first medical schools were built and erected in ancient Egypt. The first organized system of instruction and of teaching were first established in ancient Egypt. The first surgery, the first neurosurgery, the first investigations into cardiovascular physiology, all this began in the ancient kingdom of the Nile in the northeast quadrant of Africa 6,000 years ago. In fact, so well known was ancient Egypt's primacy in the area of medical science that Hippocrates would have never had the audacity to have called himself the father of medicine, because he knew better. He would have said, as Homer did, that in medicine, Egypt leaves the rest of the world behind.
First, there was the step pyramid of Saqqara, built by Imhotep during the 3rd dynasty. This is the oldest large stone structure in the world. Originally, other buildings and courtyards were constructed near the step pyramid, and this entire complex was enclosed by a wall 1,500 feet long by 900 feet wide. Today, however, the only prominent remaining structure is the step pyramid. King Sneferu of the 4th dynasty built the so-called bent pyramid several miles south of Saqqara. This structure has no steps, but is straight-sided except for a change of angle in the middle. Finally, there was the Great Pyramid, built for the pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops, also during the 4th dynasty.
The Great Pyramid,
one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is indeed a magnificent monument to contemplate. Still standing today, it originally rose 481 feet and is estimated to have contained 2,300,000 blocks of stone. The area it covers is large enough to hold the cathedrals of Florence, Milan, and St. Peter's in Rome, as well as St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey in London. The Great Pyramid contains enough stone to construct 30 Empire State Buildings. If all the stones in the pyramid were sawed into blocks 1 foot on an edge and then were laid end to end, they would stretch 2/3 of the way around the globe at the equator. There are about 80 pyramids remaining in Egypt and 100 in Nubia, or what is today called the Northern Sudan. Although scientists are not certain of the purpose of these ancient structures, it is widely believed that they served as tombs for members of the Egyptian royal family.
Okay, then we have God Ptah. This is just one of many gods. Again, they look, all of these look like African. And most of these images are either not shown or they're shown out of context. So it's